right, I think we can probably get started, Dorothy. I'll keep letting people in.
Great. We have a nice group joining us this evening. 5 pages of curious viewers. That's great. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar concerning the proposed amendment to the Wisconsin Constitution that will appear on the November 5th ballot. That amendment will become part of the Constitution of Wisconsin if a majority of voters vote in favor of it. Today, we have 3 speakers who will break down that amendment and discuss its implications. We'll then take a few minutes to complete actions to encourage fellow Wisconsin voters to join us in voting no on this ballot question. I'm this evening's moderator, Dorothy Sky, president of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. First of all, what does the November 5th ballot measure say? The question that will appear on your ballot is eligibility to vote. Shall Section 1 of Article 3 of the Constitution, which deals with suffrage, be amended to provide that only a United States citizen age 18 or older who resides in an election district may vote in an election for national, state, or local office, or at a statewide or local referendum? And now, folks, look carefully for the placement of this question on your ballot. It may be in a corner on the backside. Our speakers tonight will share their 3 different perspectives on this proposed amendment and explain the potential adverse consequences if it becomes incorporated in our Wisconsin Constitution. They are Attorney Dan Lenz from Law Forward, Iuscely Flores from the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign and Wisconsin Fair Maps Coalition, and Attorney Jasleen Singh from the Brennan Center. Dan Lenz will explain the implications of the change from every citizen to only a citizen. Iuscely Flores will share her personal experiences as a non-citizen in Wisconsin. Jasleen Singh will discuss the myth of non-citizen voting. So audience members, please put your questions in the chat as they come to mind, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. First up is Dan Lenz, an attorney with Law Forward. Law Forward describes itself as a pro-democracy nonprofit that uses strategic litigation to develop the law so that in Wisconsin, democracy includes all of us. Dan came to Law Forward with over a decade of litigation experience, including past work involving election administration. He's honored to be at Law Forward, working on behalf of voters and democratic institutions. Dan has lived in Wisconsin for almost 20 years, and during his career has represented clients all over the state. Dan, you're up.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Dan Lenz. Thank you so much, Dorothy, for that lovely introduction and for introducing the topics we're going to talk about tonight. Before I get started and share my slideshow, which I'm sure I'll screw up, I just want to say how honored I always am to be speaking to members of the League. One of the great joys of working at Law Forward, and one of the ways that we're able to do our work is through partnership with organizations like the League, and specifically the League. The League has been an amazing partner throughout my entire time at Law Forward, as a thought partner, as a client, as just a leader in this space. And it's a huge tribute to the amount of work that activists and members like all of you do, that the League is such an important part of preserving and enhancing our democracy throughout Wisconsin and throughout the nation. So with that, I'm going to try to share my screen. Bear with me. Okay. So I'll just kind of click through a little bit. That's me when I was, a year or two younger. I've been with Law Forward, as Dorothy said, for a couple of years. And one of the things that we're always involved in Law Forward is what are the emerging threats to our democracy? What are things that are coming on the horizon? And I think, as we'll talk about this evening, this most recent amendment, like many of the amendments, like the April amendments and the August amendments, and now this one, represent an attempted erosion of our democracy and a power grab by the legislature to try to give itself more power at the expense of other branches of government or hear the voters. So the first thing I want to talk about this evening are the possible meanings or implication of changing the language of our Constitution in Article 3 from every citizen to only citizens, which is what the legislature is proposing. And we should understand two things. And the first is kind of a lawyerly caveat, which comes with this dramatic animation, which is we don't really necessarily know what this is going to mean and what's going to happen. And that is true whenever we change the language of our Constitution, of any Constitution. Most states guarantee in their constitutions the right to vote. There is not the same sort of corresponding strong textual guarantee in the federal Constitution, though that's been read in various ways. But we have a strong state guarantee for our Constitution. And we don't know what it will necessarily mean for courts 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 100 years from now. We're interpreting what we did here today, or what the legislature is proposing to do, and what that means. And that's an inherently kind of dangerous thing. Litigants and attorneys come up with arguments, they come up with ideas, and courts seize on them. And it may have nothing to do with what the drafters intended at the time, or what the voters intended at the time, but it's the way that constitutional litigation works. And that can be for the good, right? We've seen expansion of rights throughout our history in various ways. And it can be for the bad. We've seen contraction of those rights based on ideas about what the text should or shouldn't mean. We never necessarily know what that is going to mean. But here are some things that we do know. This is the language of Article 3 as it exists right now. Every citizen age 18 or older who's a resident of an election district within this state, is a qualified elector of that district. This language is inclusive. It's every United States citizen who meets these other criteria is an eligible voter. And it is one of, but not the only place where courts have found the right to vote to live in our Constitution, but it is kind of the clearest, most textual place. This is where we deal with suffrage. This is where we deal with the idea of who's going to be an eligible elector, what they're going to be able to do. And the court, throughout our history, has viewed that right with a corresponding strength. For over a century, our Supreme Court has recognized the right to participate in the government is an inherent right that's guaranteed in Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution. It's also found the right to vote here in Article 3, the article that we're talking about this evening. And here are some powerful quotes that we often like to throw around in litigation, because they represent a strong endorsement by the Wisconsin Supreme Court that our Constitution, as it lives and breathes, guarantees the right to vote. And that means something. It means that, for example, if we're looking at new voting restrictions, if we are dealing with a contested election in our courts, if we are thinking about whether something that the legislature is proposing to do is permissible within what we believe our constitutional guardrails are, that we know that there's a powerful right to vote out there, and it can be regulated, and it is, and that can be appropriate, but that right exists, just like the right to speak, like the right to control our bodies, which is a right that I believe in strongly, and the various rights that we all subscribe to, the right to be free in our homes of unreasonable searches, whatever it is, there's a corresponding right to vote, and that we all have to take that seriously as we are arguing and litigating and passing laws and what have you. So that gets us to the language of the proposed amendment. And in a possible way to think about it, and with the caveat that we don't necessarily know what courts are going to do, here's what we do know about this language. It changes what is currently inclusive, at least as to citizens, that every US citizen is guaranteed this right. to what is exclusive. Only US citizens are going to be voters. And however you look at it, taking something that is currently exclusive, expansive, protects one group of people, but doesn't necessarily shut out another group of people, and shutting out everyone else who's not in that group limits that right. It limits that pool of people. And how courts are going to interpret that down the road, we don't know, but we do know that what had been kind of an inclusive, powerful thing that guarantees all of our rights or guarantees the rights of all US citizens is now going to be something that's smaller, more cramped, less kind of the full-throated endorsement of voting rights that we like to see, that we think are important, that we think are inherent in other parts of our Constitution, in this part of our Constitution, and in what it means to be a resident and a citizen in the state of Wisconsin. So that gets us the idea of what those future implications could be. And one possibility, and I know this has been thrown around in various ways, one future implication of having this type of limited right of limited suffrage to citizens is that a legislature could pass requirements that voters prove their citizenship through a separate document, similarly how we now all have to prove residency when we register to vote, right? You have to prove you've been a resident of the district for 28 days through documentary proof of citizenship. And we know that this would be a problem, that this would disproportionately impact certain demographic groups. Eligible voters who aren't able to produce this type of information could be impacted. I mean, to be clear, and the slide says this as well, we at Law Forward, and I'm sure many people on this call would still argue strenuously at the top of our lungs that the Wisconsin Constitution still guarantees the right to vote in the same powerful way it does now. But having that cramped view and having that additional limitation, you could see how it slowly erodes, right? And this is how sometimes courts and litigants work. Slowly erodes that right till it's something smaller, something weaker than what we have right now. The second thing I want to talk about is the way the question is phrased, and how the question differs in some ways from what the text will actually do. And we had this language up earlier when Dorothy was speaking about the eligibility to vote, or how the question is phrased right now. Eligibility to vote, I won't read the whole thing, but it's written in one long sentence, dealing with Article 1 or Section 1 of Article 3 only. And that's the text that's all going to appear on our ballots. That is what most or many voters, that's all they'll know about what they're voting on, right? The AG produces explanatory statements. Certainly the constitutional changes that we'll see are available, but lots of folks don't have time. They don't have the energy. They don't have the interest in looking that up. And that is why the legislature phrases it this way. This is part of a pattern. Here is not even all of of what actually will change in our Constitution, which is very different for a couple of reasons. The current text is above. It's short, it's simple, it's to the point. It's what we saw earlier. And the changes, not even in full length, are below. It changes every to only, which is what we've discussed already. And then it also defines the elections at which these electors are going to be able to vote to cover all of the elections, right? National, state, or local office. And we're going to talk in a little bit about implications for how municipalities and counties are able to govern themselves. But you can see that without really mentioning it in the question, part of what the legislature is doing here is not only making this change to how suffrage is going to work, but making it clear in our Constitution in a way that cannot be changed easily that it's going to apply everywhere. It's going to apply to school board elections. It's going to apply to referenda. It's going to apply to elections to your sewer district if those are elected. Any election that we're going to have, these rules are going to apply. Here are a couple of differences that we see between how the question's phrased and what the amendment's actually going to do. For one thing, the question doesn't really describe what the current status quo is. There's nothing in that question that would let you know, hey, this is a right that you already enjoy. The Constitution already mentions U.S. citizens. Our statutes already define U.S. citizens as electors, right? We don't have non-citizen voting in Wisconsin, at least at the statewide level. The question doesn't address the scope that it's going to apply to all the elections in a way that the amendment doesn't necessarily cover right now, that what's an existing state rule is now going to cover local elections and local referenda. It doesn't explain, as I mentioned, doesn't explain that state law or federal law limits voting to citizens for state and federal elections. And this is part of an ongoing pattern that we saw in August, we saw it in April, we've seen it, we saw it back in April of 2023, we saw it with the Marsy's Law amendment that went up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, that the legislature continually tries to push the envelope in terms of how misleading these questions can be or how much information they're not going to include, right? We don't know why these amendments are put on the ballot if we look at them. We don't know who's for them and who's against them. We don't know, and frankly, not many people can tell us what exactly these are going to do. You know, we've had amendments in the past that cover very specific things, and you kind of know what the problem is and what they're intended to address. The legislature has gotten away from that and continued to pass more expansive amendments, or continue to propose more expansive amendments without clear ideas as to what the implications are. And you can sometimes see that from comments from supporters in the legislature. They don't necessarily know what's going to happen down the road. Unfortunately, in cases like the Marsy's Law case, the Wisconsin Supreme Court has given the legislature a lot of latitude as to how these questions are going to get put on the ballot, what they do and don't need to include, has really deferred to the legislature in a lot of ways and has said, we're not going to look at this too closely. We're not going to get too worried about it if there could possibly be some misinformation. So long as they are not totally counterfactual, we're going to let these stand. The last topic that I want to cover briefly this evening, I know I'm a little over time, are the implications for home rule. Wisconsin, as you see up here, in addition to the constitutional provisions we've been talking about, has a constitutional provision that protects the ability of municipalities and local governments to govern themselves. It's called the Home Rule Amendment. Currently, the law around the Home Rule Amendment, how it's been interpreted by the courts, has eroded how powerful that is. I mean, the text seems like it gives a lot of authority to the local governments. Unfortunately, that hasn't always been enforced. And we've seen lately the legislature passing laws that target home rule in Madison and Milwaukee and their pension system. But that series of cases has garnered some criticism. We've seen it from particularly Justice Ann Walsh Bradley, usually in dissent, mentioning how the Home Rule Amendment should be taken more seriously. This amendment, the amendment we're talking about this evening, would represent another step back in that process and takes powers away from the municipalities to do things like experiment with voter eligibility and experiment with things like local elections to school boards, and whether we want to expand the franchise to groups who are not currently included, non-citizens who might have students in the school system, 17-year-olds who might be participants in the school system who might want to have a voice. That sort of flexibility, which is often how we think about our democracy. It's why we, let the states govern elections. In Wisconsin, it's in part why we run elections at the municipal level, is to have a level of flexibility, of experimentation. And one thing that this amendment would do is kind of quash that before it could start. So thank you so much. I apologize for going a little bit over time.
Thank you, Dan Lenz. Our next speaker is Iuscely Flores, who will share her personal experiences as a non-citizen. Iuscely is a community mobilizer on the south side of Milwaukee. She uses her voice and digital organizing skills to help generate activities focused on self-determination and a functioning democracy. For example, she's the co-organizing director of the Wisconsin Fair Maps Coalition. She is also the racial equity and economic justice advocate for for the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, a political watchdog group that tracks money in politics. Iuscely?
Thanks, Dorothy. And just to confirm, everybody can see my screen?
You bet.
Okay. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. I'll start from the very beginning. When I was 6 years old, my parents made a difficult choice, which was to move our family to the United States and to pursue the American dream. Growing up, I often asked my dad why we had to leave our home, why we had to come here, and his answers were relatively the same. He always said we needed money. As a child, I couldn't understand why Mexico didn't offer us any money. And in 2012, under the Obama administration, I qualified for an executive order called DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. I call it my Netflix subscription to the US that I have to renew every 2 years. And every 2 years, it's increased in how much we have to pay. So it's about $605 now. There are as many as 3.6 million undocumented dreamers or young people residing in the United States, many of whom either didn't apply for DACA or they aged into the program after it stopped accepting new applications under the Trump administration. And currently, under the Biden administration, there aren't any opportunities for new applicants. So there are high school students graduating without any protection. Only a minority of the total dreamer population, approximately 530,000 dreamers, are currently protected under DACA. And every 2 years, that's about $320,650,000. Let me say it again, $320,650,000 that is being poured into the Department of Homeland Security and USCIS. In 2022, DACA recipients alongside undocumented communities contributed over $100 billion in federal, state, and local taxes. As a DACA recipient paying taxes for Social Security, Medicaid, and more, I don't qualify for any of those programs, not even in-state tuition to access higher education. I once dreamed of pursuing a career as an attorney, but there are some limitations as I can't take a bar exam. And even in Wisconsin, where you might not have to, I still can't. Some nursing students who were friends of mine also can't take any of the state exams, and they're left in limbo, and they have to find other careers. And we don't qualify for FAFSA. But my dad worked really hard to make sure that I had access to college without FAFSA or student loans, because if you're undocumented, the interest rates are way too high and unobtainable. It wasn't until college as a political science major that I finally understood why we needed money, why Mexico couldn't offer us that money. I learned about the North American Free Trade Agreement. It really had devastating consequences for Mexico, but in particular, families like mine. My grandfather owned a small trucking business in Mexico, and he was hit really hard by NAFTA. His livelihood, a business that he built with his children, was destroyed as the local trucking sector was undermined by American-owned corporations. He lost his business, and in many ways, he lost his family as well, because they were all forced to move to the belly of the beast or to the United States in search for opportunity. In the US, my dad worked as a carpet installer. I always loved driving down Lake Drive, and he would point like, oh, I installed carpet there, and he installed the flooring at MSOE. And but either way, he still faced constant discrimination due to his limited English. He was repeatedly pulled over driving to work because he didn't have a up-to-date driver's license, a common experience in Wisconsin counties that uphold 287G, which is a racist law that allows sheriff departments to act as ICE agents. This relentless harassment forced my parents to self-deport in 2018. Now, I once mentioned that I strived to become an attorney, but I couldn't. But if I want to apply to become a police officer, I can. And I can even become a police officer in counties that want to deport people like my hardworking dad. Because of DACA's limitations, I can't leave the country without excruciating circumstances like the death of a parent, or I have to be accepted into prestigious study abroad programs, and I've aged out of many of these opportunities. So I'm basically stuck in this golden cage. Some people call the US a melting pot, others call it a salad, but to me and millions, it's a very expensive gold forge cage. But I do believe that regardless of circumstance, we all have a choice. We can be outstanding citizens regardless of our status. We can love our neighbor regardless of their status. And ironically, as a non-citizen, non-voter, since 2016, I've led some of the largest Get Out the Vote initiatives in Milwaukee. I project plan and project manage for a couple small-ish organizations in Milwaukee as well, which are led by young people of color. My teams have knocked over 500,000 doors. We've called over 1 million voters. We've texted. Some of you participated in some of our the postcard drives. And I've cut the list for that as well. And I've spoken up in defense of in-state tuition for undocumented students because prior to Act 10 and the previous governor, Scott Walker, undocumented students could pay in-state tuition and people like my dad could qualify for a driver's license. But I've seen too many things be taken away by politicians who don't act in favor of the people. I've participated in civil disobediences in front of USCIS in Milwaukee when they were wrongfully detaining and processing undocumented people without any prior convictions. I even graduated and walked across the stage without any family to clap or cheer my name. But thanks to Zoom, I was able to stream the program and my parents were able to see me in their 300-person town back in Mexico. I am that job-stealing immigrant that you should be afraid of. I'll just say that. But I want to myth bust something. You know, as a non-citizen, I'm aware of the consequences of attempting to vote. And I tried it. As a matter of fact, I can't even request the ballot or attempt to register. So I think when we think about folks saying that there's ballot harvesting by non-citizens and by illegal immigrants and aliens, if you must, you can't. At least in Wisconsin, I attempted to request a ballot. I put my name down. Now you know how old I am. And it said, sorry, we can't seem to find you in our record. So I was like, okay, let me try registering to vote. I couldn't even get past step 1. I'm not eligible to vote because I must be a United States citizen to vote. The Constitution and the state have already safeguarded our voter registration program so well that people like myself can't ballot harvest. And we need to build community. We can't continue to see each other as different. We know, and I know I'm preaching to the choir because you all are here because you care. Conspiracy theories, they're not real. We know, again, that this is an attempt to divide and conquer. It's an attempt to other us and separate you from me. But I know that together, regardless of our race, what we look like, who we worship, our status, this election season, we have to come together. We have to urge everyone that we know that can vote to vote no in this attempt to protect any of our historic wins and efforts to equal access at the polls. And ultimately, we just have to ask ourselves what kind of democracy we really want to live in. Do we want a system that values and uplifts every person contributing to our communities, or one that continues to build walls between those with the most vulnerable and with those with the least? And I'll just end by saying that one of my favorite fun facts is that every 32nd, a Latino in the US turns 18. And I just spoke for about 7 minutes. So that's 270 Latinos that'll get to vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Iuscely, on a number of counts. Our third speaker is Jasleen Singh, who is a counsel in the Brennan Center Democracy Program, where she focuses on voting rights and elections. She previously served as Deputy Attorney General in the Civil Rights Enforcement Section of the California Attorney General's Office, where she worked on immigration and administrative law issues. Her work has been cited in news outlets including the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and CNN. Singh earned her BA degree in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley, and her JD from UC Berkeley Law School. Jasleen?
Hi, thank you, Dorothy, for that introduction. I'm going to quickly share my screen with you all. Okay. Thank you so much to the League for inviting me here today and for the tireless work that you do to ensure the right to vote. Thank you as well to Dan and to Iuscely for sharing their knowledge, and especially to you, Iuscely, for sharing your own personal story. Both today and in our prep sessions for this, you bring a sense of levity to a serious lie being spewed again this year, and you pointed out how practically impossible it is for folks who aren't citizens to actually get registered and to actually vote. So thank you for truly for bringing that perspective. So I work with the Brennan Center. The Brennan Center is a multifaceted advocacy organization that is part think tank, part communications hub, and part law firm. And I'm here with you all today because I wanted to offer some big picture context for the conspiracy theory of non-citizen voting that we're seeing this year. To provide a bit of a roadmap, I'm first going to talk about why the myth of non-citizen voting is indeed a myth, why it's a conspiracy theory being peddled by multiple players this year. I'll share that research has shown time and time again that non-citizen voting is vanishingly rare, that it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, and the negative consequences this conspiracy theory can have on the right to vote. So let's get started. So non-citizen voting is just simply not a widespread or even a significant occurrence, and it's already illegal. So Brennan Center published a report based off of the 2016 election, and we looked at 42 jurisdictions and surveyed election officials in those jurisdictions who oversaw the tabulation of 23.5 million people who cast a ballot in that 2016 election. And we found that those jurisdictions referred only about 30 incidents of suspected non-citizen voting for further investigation or prosecution. That's a really tiny amount. I think it's something like 0.00001%. In 2020, the conservative-leaning Cato Institute assessed and debunked a 2015 study claiming a really high percentage of non-citizen voting. And the Cato Institute concluded non-citizens don't illegally vote in detectable numbers. Additionally, we have looked at state-led investigations by Republicans and Democratic officials, which have also found no instances or barely instances of non-citizen voting. And similar investigations by news organizations, law enforcement departments, and universities have also found that non-citizen voting is extraordinarily rare. So at the get-go, this is just not an occurrence that is happening in significant numbers at all. Second, non-citizen voting is prohibited by law. So I want to make clear that the reality is states have multiple systems in place to deter non-citizens from voting. And we saw Iuscely go through the actual Wisconsin interface, the platform, and it was not able to, you're not able to actually register and vote. And so states have systems in place to deter that from happening. Federal law dictates that only US citizens can vote in federal elections. To register to vote, you have to swear you're a citizen under penalty of criminal prosecution. Elections processes are full of checks to identify ineligible voter registrants. And also under federal law, states are required to conduct regular list maintenance to remove ineligible voters from the rolls. So it's a crime many times over for folks who aren't citizens to vote in state and federal elections. And it's also extremely risky for folks who aren't citizens to cast a ballot. So if you think about it this way, if you're someone who is undocumented in this country, you'd potentially be risking everything, your freedom, your life in the US, your ability to be near family, just to cast a single ballot in an election. Practically speaking, it really just doesn't make sense. And I want to talk a little bit about the multifaceted sort of way that we have been seeing this lie be pushed by different actors. The lie of non-citizen voting being pushed by different actors on different fronts. So I'll begin on the left over here voter purge announcement. So several states, Alabama, Ohio, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, they have announced voter purges of non-citizens on their ballot rolls, on their voter rolls. And yet no state has yet to bring an actual charge against against a non-citizen for actually committing voter fraud. Texas's Attorney General recently launched an investigation, very aggressive investigation, into voter registration groups who allegedly have been registering non-citizens. We're also seeing state legislatures push for laws that make something that's already illegal another time over. So the Wisconsin ballot initiative, for example, that y'all are going to be voting on this November was put there by the legislature. And we also see that Congress is currently pushing for the passage of the SAVE Act, which would require that voters present documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote. There are also several lawsuits that have been filed across the nation where election denier plaintiff groups are asking courts to require secretaries of states to verify all voter citizenship information with the DHS. And finally, a couple of weeks ago, we saw coverage of some really egregious behavior by two folks from the Heritage Foundation. So the New York Times covered this, but in July, men working with Heritage knocked on the doors of suspected non-citizens in an apartment complex outside Atlanta, asking about the residents' citizenship status and whether they're registered to vote. Those two men misrepresented themselves as being with a company that assists Latinos with navigating the election system, and they secretly videotaped those interactions. Several of the people said they were non-citizens and had registered, which the Heritage Foundation touted as supporting its false claims on the topic. But the New York Times had reported that when state investigators went in and actually looked into the allegations, there was no record of any of these folks actually being registered. And in fact, at least one of those people told investigators that she was just giving an answer to the Heritage folks, hoping an answer would make them go away. It's a particularly dangerous new turn in this effort to undermine trust in elections through spewing this lie about non-citizens voting. So that was an overview of sort of all the ways in which we're seeing this pop up this year. And I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of these efforts. So I think one of the biggest things is that this can have a chilling effect on eligible voters. It can intimidate eligible voters who maybe just became naturalized or maybe are now confused about whether they're eligible to vote. I think one of the most dangerous things that's happening with these lies is it's sort of laying the groundwork to call into question the results of the November election. And so it's sowing doubt in our election integrity preemptively to lay the groundwork for questioning the November 2024 election. And so those are some immediate concerns given our November election and the fact that we're just 7 weeks away at this point. But I also want to take a moment to sort of follow the lie through. So what if documentary proof of citizenship was required? That risks a huge amount of voters, eligible voters, being disenfranchised from the process. In fact, millions of voters. And so the reason I say this is last year, the Brennan Center and several partner organizations conducted a survey of Americans on what identifications they possess. And our research indicates that more than 9% of American citizens, so it doesn't sound like much, but that's about 21.3 million people, don't have proof of citizenship readily available. There are a lot of reasons for this. Documents might be at home with another family member in a safety deposit box. But setting that aside, at least 3.8 million people don't have these documents at all, often because they were lost or destroyed or stolen. And our results also showed that these requirements would fall disproportionately on voters of color. These findings that we found last year are pretty consistent with a 2006 study many, many years ago that we also conducted, which found that 7% of Americans didn't have citizenship requirements readily available. So, and that also translates to a number in the millions. There are many groups, and so I want to acknowledge that this sounds very bleak, and I think there are a lot of negative consequences coming from this. There are many groups putting their heads together on how best to combat these efforts and push back on the lie about non-citizen voting. The League is one of those groups. Hosting webinars like this is one of those ways. Just today, the Brennan Center updated a resource page listing all the research and all the investigations that we're aware of by journalists, research organizations, state investigations that all lead to the same conclusion, that all in all, only citizens are voting in our elections, and that's because only citizens can vote. So I'm gonna end my presentation there, reserve time for any follow-ups, but thank you for giving me the space and platform to share these insights.
Thank you, Jasleen. And there are going to be a lot of follow-ups because I see in the chat more questions and more comments and more likes than I have ever seen in a webinar, national, state, or local. So, wow, this audience is engaged and curious. So, Joan Schwartz will now ask follow-up questions of our speakers briefly. Joan is an attorney and is chair of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin's Impartial Justice Committee, which organized this webinar. Joan?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to thank the members of the Impartial Justice Committee for all their fine work on researching and organizing for this webinar. Attorney Lenz, if this constitutional amendment passes, what may be some of the unintended consequences? And perhaps can you provide an example of how it may be handled if and when it ends up in litigation?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, and this is really part of the problem is we don't know what the consequences will be. And I'll give you an example that's sort of near and dear to my heart, right? Which has to do with the MAPS litigation from last year and how the contiguity provision of our Constitution has worked. It has been in our Constitution for decades. We kind of read it out. We didn't think it was that big of a deal until all of a sudden last year it was a big deal, and it changed how our maps are going to work and how we're going to elect our state and assembly members moving forward. And that is true of a lot of parts of our Constitution. There are parts of our Constitution that lay dormant for years, and then they spring to life because a litigant and a court or a courts seize upon an argument or seize upon a view of how that wording should work. And that can have huge policy implications. As it pertains to this precise amendment, I can't sit here, and I don't think anyone can sit here and say this is everything that's going to happen if this amendment passes. And we've seen debates. We tend to think that it makes things like documentary proof of citizen that Jasleen was just speaking about, citizenship that Jasleen was just speaking about, more likely because suddenly you have constitutional backing for this idea that you really have to prove your citizenship to vote. And that's a concern for all the reasons that Jasleen just spoke about so knowledgeably of how it could affect any number of eligible voters. But you can also see, if we weaken our voting rights, that can have huge implications across the board. Our voting rights affect everything from, how the polls are going to work, how observers programs are going to work, how much latitude we're going to give folks during recounts to make sure that votes are being counted appropriately. And we just don't know. We don't know, as we sit here today, everything that's going to happen. And that's something we should take seriously when we change our Constitution, because it's different from passing a law. And for no other reason than it's much harder to undo. To undo an amendment, you have to pass another amendment, which means you have to pass it through 2 more legislative sessions and propose it to the people in a referendum, just as this is going to be proposed in November. So if something were to go haywire, if a court were to seize upon an argument that the people don't believe in, that the legislature doesn't believe in, that the governor doesn't believe in, they can't fix it quickly. And that, because it's based on our Constitution, we're not supposed to change our Constitution on a whim. We're not supposed to do it in ways that we don't fully understand, what those implications are going to be. And so, I wish I could tell everyone, this is bad because X, Y, Z is going to happen. But in part, this is bad because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But what we do know is that this language changes something that is currently broad and inclusive, at least for a lot of folks. And we heard from Iuscely, that's not inclusive for a lot of folks in our communities, and who should have a voice in our democracy. But it's inclusive for some folks, and it makes it even more tight and rigid. And that's really unfortunate.
Thank you very much. Okay, Iuscely, I understand that you do not have a path to citizenship. Can you tell us why you have no chance of ever becoming a citizen?
Thanks. Unfortunately, this isn't the same give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be breathe free US that we all think we know and love. There isn't a single path to citizenship because immigration is just so highly regulated now after 1924 and especially after 9/11. And so as an only child, I don't have a sibling that can petition for me. And even then, the wait list to petition a sibling or a really immediate relative is over 26 years long. I don't have $1 million to give the stock market. And even then, I'd only get some sort of lottery U visa. Thankfully, I'm not a victim of a crime or I'm not a victim of domestic violence, because that's another option for people to get in, a U visa of some sort, but that never means citizenship. That means a U visa, an opportunity to maybe become a conditional permanent resident. But I'm also, was hoping to get married, but life has its own path. And even as somebody that would would want to get married, that still ties us to a partner, and that still ties us to the patriarchy in a way. So there really is not a path. And I have to say, like, there is no way that I would want to risk losing my job by attempting to vote, by going to jail for 5 years, by being deported, by being fined. Like, a lot of undocumented people fear the system so much that they don't even answer the door to the census. We struggle to get people to trust the government, even people that are citizens. So it's really difficult to become a citizen in the US now.
Thank you, Iuscely. That is heartbreaking to hear. Thank you. And the next question I'd like to ask of Jasleen. Do you see any parallels between the myth about non-citizen voting and the myth or conspiracy theory about mail-in voting fraud in the 2020 election?
Absolutely. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. No, I absolutely see a parallel between those two things. So in 2020, as many of us may recall, the big lie was that vote by mail couldn't be trusted. And now, sitting in 2024, it's that non-citizens are voting in droves to steal the election. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it's all an effort to lay the groundwork to call into question the results of the 2024 election. And I want to also just take a quick moment while I have the mic on me, but I know a lot of what I've shared today and we've all shared today can have very real, perhaps very intimidating or confusing effects on voters. So one note to all the voters who are here, who may be confused or uncertain about their eligibility to vote, or even if you're not uncertain, it's really important to check your voter registration now to make sure everything is up to date now, before you go to the polls or before you mail in your ballot. And today is National Voter Registration Day. So if you're not yet registered to vote, this is your reminder to get registered to vote as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. Okay, Dorothy, you want to move on from here?
Okay, we will bring up what's in that chat, that very busy chat, I promise. But first, Molly Carmichael, the State League's communication manager, will now talk to us for just a minute about actions we all need to take before the November 5th election. Molly?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on this Tuesday evening. I am going to take just a second and share my slides. Hold on. Okay. How's that look for everyone?
Good.
Great. Thanks for bearing with me. I have like 100 tabs open, so my computer is freaking out a little bit. But yeah, thanks so much for our wonderful speakers for joining us. I see there's a lot of questions and robust conversation in the chat. So rest assured, after this short little interlude portion of the webinar, we're going to get back and make sure we answer those questions. But as you can see, we are going to talk about the toolkit we have, so that way we can spread the word for folks to vote no. We're going to go through some actions, and then we're going to take just a few minutes to actually text our friends and start spreading, correct information about this amendment. And I'm just going to start off by reiterating that a recording of this webinar, this toolkit, it's all going to be on lwvwi.org. We're going to email it directly to you. We're going to blast it out on social media. You're probably going to be sick of seeing it, but we hope that it's super accessible, easy to find. And we also want you to share this with your friends. If you're part of other local organizations, please do share it with them. Post it on your personal accounts. Social media, just start bugging people in a friendly way. So first up, we're going to go through the toolkit. So this toolkit is way more than one page, but we only have one up here today. And we hope it's a very helpful resource to kind of break down the question. When you dive into it, some of the first things you'll see are some of the top 3 top line points to vote no. And excuse me, I'm a little hoarse today. Next, you'll see some messaging. So this messaging can be used for social media. You can use it when you're talking with friends, like I said, bringing this to other clubs and organizations you're in, bringing it up there. There's also lots of different content that we hope you'll share. Again, if you're part of a league, on your league page, on pages for other organizations. I'm part of lots of neighborhood Facebook pages, so always sharing posts there. And again, just sharing it on your personal page is a really good way to kind of get out of this space and start bringing friends and family who maybe aren't as politically engaged into the mix, and making sure that when they go to vote before on November 5th, they're ready for this question and they know why to vote no. And the toolkit also has lots of different actions. So this includes templates. So a letter to the editor template. So you can reach out to your local newspaper, local publications. And we hope that this template is a guide. So that way, you don't feel like you have to start from scratch and it doesn't take you too long. And we're always here if you need assistance getting placed. It also has information. Again, if you're looking to bring a speaker into a group, a weekly meeting, even if it's something super informal like a book club, reach out to us. We'd love to come and chat with you. It also includes materials. So that includes stuff like flyers. If you want to print out some flyers, I always hang it up at my yoga studio's bulletin board just for people who are passing by. Hopefully it catches their eye and they can learn a bit more about the question. And again, we hope you dive into this and you take a few minutes just to look at all of the various actions and materials we have. And like I said, we'll make sure you get the toolkit, but if anyone wants to just pull out their phone, I'll give you about 5 seconds to scan the QR code if you want to take a look at it right now. And again, lwvwi.org is where you can find all of our publicly available resources. All right, so like I was saying earlier, it's really important that we start reaching out to our friends and family now about this constitutional amendment, because very often our friends are our most trusted source. If you're like me, you're probably the person in the friend group who gets all of the questions about how do I register to vote? How do I change my address? Who are you voting for? What does this mean? What can I expect? So I'm sure a lot of folks on this call are kind of in the same boat. So we're not going to wait for our friends to text us on the morning of November 5th. We're going to start texting them now, tonight, so that way they're ready. And maybe they can even text some of their friends of their own. So we're going to do something called a friend bank, which is, of course, a combination of text bank when you might be texting random people and friend. So we're basically just texting our friends. You know, we have a whole list of people here of different ideas. If you're feeling a little nervous to start reaching out to people, pick someone who loves you unconditionally and then go from there. Start going to acquaintances, coworkers, you know, someone who you work out with, like I said, book club, any big group chats that you might have. That's a good way to hit multiple people with one text. And yeah, we're going to take about 3 minutes and we're going to see how many people all together as a collective we can text in 3 minutes. And I know in past webinars, we've hit like over 100 people, 200 people in 3 minutes. And some of my lovely coworkers are actually going to put a script from the toolkit. We have a pre-written text script that's going to be in the chat. So you can copy and paste it, or you can just kind of use it as a guide, you know, kind of work through it, grab a sentence or two you like. And yeah, we're gonna kind of start the clock. And I encourage all of you to pull out your phones. You can also totally do this on email and start texting people. And again, if they want more information, it is up on our website. And I might try to play music. All right, I've already texted about 4 people today, so give it another minute or two. And feel free to put how many people you've texted in the chat. Everyone hear me okay? All right, great. Thank you all who participated in that. Again, the text or friend bank scripts are in the toolkit, so you can do it at other times as well. But yeah, please do put the number of people you reached in the chat, and we're going to add that up and see our collective impact in just about 3 minutes. So yeah, thank you all so much. And I'll throw it back to Dorothy.
Thank you, Molly. You are so creative. Your communication tools are just a treasure, and we're going to dip into that treasure chest for this instance and on into the future. So thanks so much. Now for the all-important Q&A. The ability for audience members to interact with our speakers is a great advantage of this format, and you audience members certainly decided to take advantage of that in this case. So Joan Schwartz and Molly, as needed, what's in the chat?
Hey, lots of questions and lots of laments about concerns about the amendment. Dan, I'm going to give you this first question. What did the legislature say was the purpose of this amendment? Do you have any idea?
I mean, the legislature as a whole didn't tell us their purpose, at least as far as I know. We have heard from individual legislators that some of which are just, you know, repeating this conspiracy theory that there is widespread voting by non-citizens in state and federal elections. We know from every credible source and from some non-credible sources that that's not the case, but there is this theory that it's happening and that somehow cancels out or dilutes votes. We heard that I think most recently from a representative in support of the amendment, and we've also heard, you know, this idea that municipalities are going to expand non-citizen voting, which, you know, may or may not be something that a municipality wants to try down the road, but currently it's not something that's happening in Wisconsin. It's happening in 16, I think was the last number I saw, 16 municipalities across the country. None of them are here. You know, I think I saw in the chat that this is a solution in search of a problem. I think that's true. I think the legislators, even in support of it, are having a tough time coming up with something. Whether there are other political reasons, whether they're, you know, that folks might want this on the ballot in November is kind of beyond my pay grade, but that's one other possibility.
And while you're still up, could you just briefly explain, because there were questions about what's required for a referendum to become a constitutional amendment? How does a constitutional amendment get on the ballot?
So in Wisconsin, we have two ways we can amend our constitution. One is a constitutional convention, which we've never done. The other is the amendment process that this follows, which is every proposed amendment has to pass through two successive legislatures. So you know, we had a legislature that was elected in 2022. We're gonna have a new one elected in 2024. We had one elected in 2020. And so, you know, they're elected biannually. And so it has to pass through two of those, and then it has to be approved by the majority of the people voting in an election, in a statewide election. So we have seen statewide elections in April, in August, though having a constitutional amendment in the August election was unusual. We don't think that's really happened before, to have it on a primary, but that's kind of beyond the point. So that's how they generally get done. Importantly, and something we didn't discuss, is that Wisconsin does not have a citizen-led amendment process. So it's not as though, you know, if this were to pass, that citizens could petition to have the amendment changed back, or to have some other language changed, or to put some other strong voting rights language in our Constitution. We don't currently have that mechanism. To create that mechanism would in fact itself require a constitutional amendment. So something else to consider as we consider, you know, what some unintended consequences are and how difficult they can be to undo when we change our Constitution.
Someone asked in the chat if this amendment's going to make our elections more secure. Do you think that will have anything to do with our election security?
I will answer very briefly because I'm still up. No.
Yes, it's for you, Dan. I'm sorry.
That's fine. No, they won't make our elections are secure. You know, as Jasleen said, every study that has found that this is not a real problem. This does not affect our elections, and having this in our constitution kind of hurts us all without really making any substantial impact on our elections. But Sally and Jasleen, I'm sure, also have thoughts on this.
A number of poll workers asked a number of questions, and maybe you can answer this one, Dan, and then I'll get to the other people as well. Are poll workers going to be able to explain the difference to a voter, the difference between every and only? Can they even answer those questions for voters?
Likely not. And even if it were permissible, that is not a great way to run a railroad, right? Because then we have thousands and thousands of poll workers, which is a strength of our system. You know, we run our elections ourselves, citizens, volunteers, folks in the community come out to volunteer to work as poll workers. I've done it. I'm sure many, many people in this chat have done it. It's great. It's rewarding. I encourage, in addition to checking your registration, making sure you have a plan to vote. If you can be a poll worker, it's an amazing experience and a great way to participate in our democracy. But it doesn't include things like training on the meaning of the constitutional amendments. That's not something we expect our poll workers to do. And, we'd probably see lots and lots of different answers because it's lots of folks in our communities. There is an explanatory statement from the Attorney General that is publicly available, that should be posted in polling places. There is sort of a process to have that sort of statewide explanation, but you certainly shouldn't expect or count on the poll workers to carry that load in addition to the million other jobs they're doing on and before Election Day.
And somebody just put in a chat now, poll workers are not, in caps, able to explain anything to a voter regarding language of a referendum. So yes, thank you. Attorney Singh, I would like to ask you about one of the questions coming through is, have any other states passed legislation to provide for documentary proof of citizenship?
So the only state that I'm aware of that requires this for state elections only is Arizona. Arizona has a bifurcated system where if you want to vote in state elections, you have to provide documentary proof of citizenship. But that is not required. Documentary proof of citizenship, to be clear, is not required for federal elections.
Can you explain a little bit further about how a dual registrations? I just want to make clear, this amendment does not require documentary proof of citizenship. But as many of you are asking in the question, this leads, perhaps open the door to that being the next step. And it is the next step in Arizona. Could you explain how a dual registration system works, how it will work?
I mean, I think that it can be quite messy. I think Arizona's had it for a number of years, and so their clerks and elected officials have made it, made it work. But I can tell you that it is currently under litigation. There were efforts by the Arizona legislature, I can't remember, since 2020 to impose additional requirements, potentially for federal elections. But it is being litigated right now. I think it's quite complicated. I think it's quite messy. I think practically speaking, for folks who are administering our elections, think about yourselves. If you're hosting a statewide election, if you're running a statewide election, do you as an elected official want to have different ballots going on, and two completely different systems for two different types of voters? I think it's a complicated endeavor, and I think it's getting at a problem that doesn't exist. It's trying to find a solution to a problem that doesn't exist.
If this ever occurs in Wisconsin to require documentary proof of citizen, who will be disproportionately affected, Jasleen? How will that work?
So Based on our research, voters of color will be disproportionately affected. Our research tells us that voters of color tend to not have access to citizenship documents as easily as white voters. And I also think elderly voters are going to be disproportionately affected by this, because if you, just practically speaking, if you've been voting without having to show proof of citizenship for decades, maybe you don't know where your birth certificate is. Maybe it's somewhere, or it's with a family member, or maybe you're now in a nursing home, but your documents are not necessarily quite with you. And so I feel, so those groups of folks, but also just everyday folks who are not keeping track of where their citizenship documents are, it's going to affect voters in all demographics.
And what would happen if somebody, well, let me go, there's another question about the SAVE Act that is right now being pushed in Congress. Can you give us some information about the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act that the that Congress is trying to get passed?
Yeah, so at a very high level, it would require documenting proof of citizenship to register to vote. It is, I believe it's being put to a vote on the House floor tomorrow. So we'll see what happens with that. But what it is just another attempt to sort of peddle this lie to find a solution to a problem that doesn't exist.
If this were to pass, one question, would this affect mail-in registration in any way, given today being the National Voter Registration Day? Would it affect mail-in registration if we had to have documenting proof of citizenship?
I mean, it would affect the way that our voter registration system, whether for mail, whether for in person, it would affect the way that we vote in this country.
Probably in a pretty massive way. Yeah. Would someone have to register every time with proof of citizenship every time that they moved?
I am not sure about that.
Okay. Molly, have you picked up any other questions from the chat that would be helpful for us to talk about?
There's a lot of different conversations. I think a lot of questions have been answered either just now or throughout different presentations or in the chat.
Yeah, there still were a number of questions about the distinction between every and only. There were lots of questions about that. And so, Dan, I'm just going to ask you if you can kind of go back over what you said initially, why that language change, which seems so innocuous, is really significant.
Well, in part because it takes what's currently a floor and makes it a ceiling, you know, is another way to think about it. And another way I've sometimes phrased it when talking to friends or family about it, right? What we have now is a floor. We know all US citizens are eligible electors, and this is going to put that as a ceiling, but that's the only people who can be included. And how that is going to play out, and I apologize, I keep saying this, but it is both the lawyerly answer and the true answer. How that's going to play out over time will remain to be seen. You know, who's going to twist that into something that impacts voting rights more generally, or make sure that we can never have the type of experimentation that extended the right to vote to women, to all Americans, to Americans who own property, to Black Americans, you know, that type of work in our democracy, how it's going to affect that will remain to be seen. But we know that it is going to be smaller and weaker, and a weaker protection for everybody.
And you did make some reference to the 16 municipalities that allow non-citizens to vote. Can you make a comment about anything about those 16 municipalities?
Sure. So I am not an expert in all of these programs. What I do understand from what I've read is that some municipalities have experimented in this way, particularly for very local elections like school board elections, where, you know, if you're a permanent resident of a municipality, you have kids in the school system, you know, you're absolutely legally entitled to be there, to be a participant in this community, and you want to have a voice in how your children are going to be educated the same way that everyone else in the, or many other people in the community have that voice. That some municipalities have said, we want you to participate. You know, you have a vested stake in this like everyone else. And that is sort of how we think of democracy more broadly. And so they've passed ordinances, and many of which get litigated, many of which get challenged in court. I think New York tried this, and the state Supreme Court shut it down. They call their Supreme Court the Court of Appeals, but their highest court shut it down, saying it wasn't permissible under their constitution. So it's not a sure thing. I'm not saying that even as things stand right now that this would be possible in Wisconsin. That idea, as far as I know, has never been tested, but that would be, you know, sort of how it works.
And
And
Jonas,
oh, I'm sorry.
I could add just one point to what Dan just said.
Okay, great.
Some municipalities have actually had those ordinances for a while now. And, you know, in looking at the research that has taken a look at data surrounding non-citizens voting, it's not, so for example, I know Maryland has a couple of jurisdictions that allow this at least, and it's not like Maryland now is rampant with voter fraud or with non-citizens voting in their state elections or federal elections. And so, you know, these states have been able to make it work for those municipalities to allow non-citizens to vote, but and yet the state elections run smoothly and securely separately.
Jasleen, while we're with you, you mentioned the types of people that are going to be disproportionately affected by this. And one of the folks in the chat asked, couldn't it also disproportionately affect women who change their names or when they get married or divorced? And what about people who are born at home and don't have a birth certificate?
I mean, I think that's right. And that's why I say there may be disproportionate effects that we've measured before, and we can say for certain, but so many people would be effective and potentially disenfranchised by a requirement to show documentary proof of citizenship.
Okay, well, I think we may be at the end of all of our questions, unless somebody has a further question that they would like to ask. Anybody? Okay, well, Dorothy, you can bring it to a close then. Thank you, everybody, for all your questions. They're great. Big, busy chat tonight.
And the comments, I love it all.
Oh,
Now,
can I
Molly,
make
could you
I'm sorry, Dorothy,
that
let
last? Go ahead.
let me make one comment. I didn't have any questions for you, Iuscely, but the comments to you in the chat are beautiful. There is so much praise and admiration and respect for who you are and what you've done. And so there are no further questions to you, but everybody's hearts have gone out to you tonight. So thank you. Hey, Dorothy.
You bet. Yeah, this presentation has definitely been packed with useful information, but Iuscely's sharing her personal experience adds another dimension that's just, yeah, takes your breath and your heart away. So Molly has popped up the final slide that reminds us of the final word, which is vote, 2 words, vote no. Earlier this year, 56% of Wisconsin voters had the good sense to say no to the August 13th amendment proposal to strip the governor of his authority to distribute federal funds to Wisconsin. This November 5th ballot measure again stems from a gerrymandered legislature's attempt to assume more and more power. It introduces a thinly veiled strategy to suppress the vote. The legislature's recent barrage of proposed constitutional amendments is designed to attempt an end run around the practice of legislators passing bills that the governor can then veto or sign into law. The legislature's use of constitutional amendments to avoid the executive veto negatively affects the balance of power embedded in our state constitution. Do we approve of these motives and tactics? No. Shouldn't the legislature spend more time doing its job and less time trying to erode our voting rights? Wisconsin is stronger together, and this proposed constitutional amendment undermines that strength. It is yet another attempt by a gerrymandered state legislature to divide us and pit us against our neighbors. Our response on November 5, in that box that may be tucked away in the back of the corner of the ballot, should be a firm and resounding no. By that means we will say we want Wisconsin to keep moving forward. The recording of this webinar will be available on the League of Women Voters website, lwvwi.org, and the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin YouTube page tomorrow. We will email the recording directly to the registrants, along with access to Molly's great toolkit. So please share the recording and its message far and wide with your friends and family. And thanks to all of you. Bye for now.